The first mortar walked into the depot yard 40 feet from where I was standing, and it took every trained reflex I had not to dive face first into the fuel berm. Gravel and debris rained down on my helmet. A second round hit 8 seconds later, a direct strike on the maintenance shed roof, and I felt that one through the soles of my boots on the packed earth. The pressure wave was enough to stagger a man sideways if he was standing on the wrong patch of ground, and 2 of my soldiers went down to one knee before their training caught up with them and they moved. Sergeant First Class Dana Reyes was already on her radio before the debris finished falling, calling the grid back to the TOC with the kind of controlled voice that costs something to maintain when the ground is shaking around you. Cover Fuel Bay, move. I had been running the logistics depot at Crestfall for 6 months. It was not a glamorous posting. We pushed fuel, spare parts, ammunition pallets, and maintenance support across a valley that was still contested enough to matter, supporting 3 forward positions and a rotating set of attached units. The depot sat on a flat stretch of crushed gravel between a ridgeline to the east and a dry wash to the south, and it had been quiet long enough that some of the soldiers had started leaving their plates on their cots when they moved between buildings. I had been fighting that habit for 3 weeks. Reyes ran the vehicle maintenance section, and I had her people sorted out the way you sort any good unit, by their skills, by their composure under pressure, by who you could lean on when the original plan was no longer available. She ran a tight operation. Her soldiers knew what they were doing. The 2 women who had been leaning against the front fender of the deuce and a half when the first round hit were not part of my morning's priorities. Not at first. One of them was Specialist Lena Croft, Reyes's twin sister, down on a 3-day pass from Fort Madden, where she served weekends with a reserve support company. She was wearing borrowed ACUs that fit her in the shoulders but were loose at the waist, and I had watched her walk the depot that morning, with the particular interest of someone seeing a sibling's world for the first time, curious, present, but not at home in the way a stationed soldier is at home. Reyes had pointed her out during morning formation with obvious pride, and I had given Lena Croft perhaps 4 seconds of attention before returning to the daily maintenance log. The woman standing beside her I had not even gotten a name for. Same general build as Lena, same dark hair pulled back under a borrowed cap, same set to the jaw that the Croft family apparently issued along with the cheekbones. She had arrived with Lena the evening before. Reyes had mentioned her in passing, a friend from the reserve unit, there to drive Lena up because the post bus ran at an inconvenient hour, and Lena had too much gear to manage alone. I had registered the information the way you register information that has no operational relevance, briefly, and then not at all. The third mortar hit the motor pool and flipped a Humvee door clean off its hinges. I heard the door clang against the fuel bay wall 40 feet away. Then I heard someone screaming, and I stopped thinking about visitors. Croft, I needed a body to pull casualties while Reyes managed the radio. Croft on me. When I glanced back at the deuce and a half, Lena Croft was crouching behind the front tire, her hands gripping the wheel well, her head down and her eyes tracking. The other woman, Reyes's friend, the driver, was no longer where she had been standing. She had not gone to the fuel bay. She had not gone flat against the tire stack on the east side where 2 of my soldiers were already pressed into the concrete. I marked that absence in some corner of my awareness and let it go, because Private First Class Hendricks was down in the motor pool with a gash across his forearm and blood on the floor around him. I got Hendricks behind a wheel assembly. The field dressing from my belt was enough to control the bleeding if I kept pressure on it. The mortars had a pattern 5 to 8 seconds between rounds, then a longer pause, then another sequence. I counted while I worked and I thought about angles. The craters in the yard were all oriented northeast from their blast scattering, which put the tube to the southwest. The ridgeline southwest of the depot was where the civilian grading crew had been working last month, which meant there was a graded road up there, which meant whoever was running that tube had driven up with it on a vehicle rather than carried it in on foot. A set position. 2 or 3 people, most likely. A gunner, a spotter, maybe a security man. Sergeant Aldrin. Reyes appeared at my shoulder, her face controlled and flat. 6 soldiers confirmed in the fuel bay, 3 more pulling casualties out of Bay 2. Donovan and Ortega are behind the tire stack on the east wall. Your sister? Behind the fuel bay, she's fine. Reyes paused for exactly the length of time a careful person takes to select a word. Mara's gone up toward the high ground on the east side. I looked at her. Who's Mara? The woman who came with Lena. Reyes held my gaze steadily. She asked me where the elevation was. I pointed her east. She said she had it. That landed badly. A visitor, a reservist from a support company, a woman I had not even obtained a name for, had moved toward elevated terrain while the mortar team was still working the yard. My first clear thought was that I was going to be writing casualty reports about a civilian who had no business going toward the high ground and who was now going to get herself killed on my depot. Get her back, I said. I tried. Reyes' voice stayed flat. She was already past the perimeter fence. The mortars kept hitting. For another 4 minutes the rounds walked the motor pool and the south end of the equipment yard in a pattern that told me they were hunting vehicles rather than personnel. You kill the trucks at a logistics depot, and you've achieved something lasting without triggering a massive response. I kept everyone in cover, kept counting, kept adjusting my picture of where the tube was sitting. Then a rifle shot rang out from the east ridgeline. One shot, flat and sharp in the dry air. A bolt gun by the sound, the metallic working of the action was audible between mortar rounds, clear and distinct. Nothing like the pop of a service rifle. 6 seconds of silence, then a second shot. Then the mortars stopped. I held everyone down for 90 seconds. Nothing came. I told Reyes to maintain cover and keep everyone in place, and I moved along the base of the equipment shed toward the eastern perimeter fence, staying low, watching the ridgeline for any sign of movement. She was on the second rock shelf above the depot, not at the water tank platform at the top of the hill, which would have been the obvious choice and the tallest feature in sight. She had gone to a lower shelf that I wouldn't have chosen. Later I understood why. From that shelf she had a clean sight line southwest toward the tube position while keeping the depot's fuel tanks out of the background behind her rounds. If she had gone to the top she would have had the ground team and the depot's fuel storage in the same line of fire. She had thought about what was behind her targets before she chose her position. That kind of calculation takes more than familiarity with a rifle. She was rising from the prone when I reached her, moving without hurry, brushing gravel from the jacket she had been using as a rest beneath the rifle. The rifle itself was not military issue. It was a bolt-action with a scope that I recognized as serious equipment, the kind of glass you see at long-range precision competitions, not at a unit range day. A privately owned firearm, well-maintained, the stock worn smooth in the places a shooter's hands habitually fall. She turned when she heard my boots on the rock behind her. 3 personnel, she said. Her voice was the same tone you use to read a grid coordinate back to confirm it. 1 tube. They repositioned after my second shot, moved approximately 60 meters northwest along the ridgeline. I engaged them at the second position before they could reorient the tube. She held up her phone with the screen toward me. I have both grids marked. I stood there with the sun heating the back of my neck and the depot still trailing smoke below us. You're a supply specialist, I said. That's right, she offered nothing further. With a civilian bolt gun in the truck. I go to the range before I drive home. I had it in the bed box. She said this as a statement of logistics, no different from explaining why she had a spare tire. I took her phone, noted the grid coordinates, and called them in. The quick reaction force left the main gate 52 minutes later. They were on the ridgeline inside 90 minutes, and they confirmed what she had reported. 3 personnel at 2 separate positions, both consistent with the angles and distances she had described. The second position showed evidence that the team had been in the process of reorienting the tube when they were hit. They had not completed the reorientation. It was Reyes who sat me down that evening and gave me a proper accounting of who Mara Holden was. We were alone in the vehicle bay after the last debrief, the overhead lights humming, the soldiers somewhere outside eating. Reyes stood with her arms folded and looked at me with the patience of someone who is about to explain something that should not have needed explaining. She competed for 11 years, Reyes said. National level 3-position rifle. She placed in the top 5 at the national championship 4 separate times. Her last year competing she took 2nd overall in the open division. She let that settle before continuing. After she aged out of the junior program and finished her degree, she applied for the Army marksmanship unit. The timing was wrong, she had family responsibilities and the unit's commitment schedule didn't align. She joined a reserve support company because the 1 weekend a month structure gave her the flexibility to keep training on her own time and at her own expense. I looked at the wall. She has been running a long-range practical course on her personal time for 3 years, Reyes said. Open enrollment for reserve units, no charge. She does it because she believes the reserve component should have better precision marksmanship exposure than the standard training cycle provides. Reyes paused. Part of the reason she came up here with Lena was to look at the range complex 2 miles east of this depot. She's been working an approval request to open it for reserve use for 8 months. She knows this terrain, she's walked it. I thought about the shelf she'd chosen. The second shelf, not the highest point, the position that kept the fuel tanks out of the backstop. She had a rest figured out before she got there, I said. The jacket was already folded when I reached her. She's been solving improvised rest problems since she was 16 years old. Reyes' voice was level. She has practiced this for longer than most of our soldiers have been in uniform. I walked back through the afternoon in my head. The shot timing, the repositioning under fire, the grid reports delivered before I'd even made it to her position. The way she had described the engagement afterward, distances, wind condition, a note that the first shot had required her to pause because her hands were shaking, and the matter-of-fact way she had said it. That last part bothered me more than anything else in a way that took me a while to identify. She had told me she was shaking on the first shot. She had told me she'd had to pause. And then she had told me the second shot was better and by the third she'd had it sorted. She said this with the same tone she would use to describe a mechanical problem she had resolved. There was no drama in it. It was a performance report, accurate and complete. I found her after dark, sitting on Reyes' tailgate with Lena, the rifle laid out on a cleaning cloth between them. Lena was talking with both hands, the way people talk when they're releasing a day's worth of compressed energy. Mara was listening and working the bolt assembly without looking at her hands, the way you handle something you've handled 10,000 times. I owe you an apology, I said. She looked up from the bolt. She waited. When Reyes told me you'd gone up toward the high ground, my exact thought was that I was going to have a civilian casualty to account for. I said it plainly because the point was accuracy, not performance. I had you cataloged as a visitor. I was wrong about who I was looking at. She held the bolt up for a moment, checking the face, then set it down on the cloth. You didn't know, she said. I didn't ask. I looked at the rifle. The position you chose, the second shelf instead of the water tank platform. You worked out the fuel tank backstop problem before you committed to the spot. She glanced at the rifle, then back at me. The top of the hill would have put the tanks directly behind the first position. A miss on those shots carries somewhere. That's not acceptable. No, I agreed, it's not. The lower shelf gave me the same angle on the tube without that problem. It was 10 seconds to figure that out. She paused. The hard part was the repositioning. I wasn't sure how far they'd moved until I spotted them moving. I almost said something then about the difference between solving that problem in a competition environment and solving it under incoming fire. I didn't say it because she had already solved it, and commentary after the fact serves the commentator more than the soldier. I'm putting together a range qualification roster, I said instead. 12 slots, a mix of precision work and practical problems, soldiers from the depot and the attached elements. I held her gaze. I want you in the first slot. The expression that crossed her face was quiet and specific. Not relief, not triumph. Something more like the recognition of something returning to its proper place. Yes, she said, I'd like that very much. Lena was watching us from beside her on the tailgate with a look I had to sit with for a while afterward. It wasn't pointed. It wasn't a told you so. It was just the clear expression of someone who has known a person for their whole life and has been waiting for the rest of the world to catch up. The next morning I put my soldiers together in the vehicle bay, and I told them what I knew. All of it. The 11 years of competitive shooting and the national standings and the range course she ran on her own time, and the 8 months of pushing the approval for the range complex east of the depot. I told them about the two positions, the repositioning under fire, the grids delivered accurate to within 5 meters of what the QRF confirmed on the ridgeline. I told them that the mortar attack on Crestfall Depot had ended because a visiting reservist in borrowed ACUs had made a better decision than any of us trained soldiers had made in the first 60 seconds, and then had executed that decision under conditions that would have been difficult for professionals. Private Donovan, who had made a remark the morning before about the sisters walking the yard like they were on a base tour, stood with his hands at his sides and found the middle distance to look at. Specialist Ortega, who had said something about the borrowed uniform not fitting right, studied the floor of the vehicle bay. I did not push either of them. The lesson was in the facts. My commentary would have diluted it. The commendation I wrote for Mara Holden went up through the chain with my full recommendation. I wrote it myself, every word. The supporting statement said what I could prove, that on the date in question, a reserve supply specialist visiting Crestfall Depot as a private civilian had independently identified the source of a mortar attack, moved to an elevated firing position under active fire, engaged 2 separate enemy crew positions with precision rifle fire, neutralized the attack, and reported accurate grid coordinates before the quick reaction force could organize a response. No orders had been given to her. No request for support had been made. No recognition had been sought. What I remember most clearly from that day is not the explosions, and it is not the confirmation grids from the QRF, and it is not even the 2 flat rifle shots from the rock shelf above the eastern fence. What I remember is the cleaning cloth on the tailgate that night and her hands moving through the bolt assembly without her eyes following them, and Lena talking beside her, and the simple, plain, ordinary fact of a person taking care of a tool she had been trusted with for a long time. No ceremony to it, no performance. I had walked past her twice that morning without knowing who she was. She had spent that same morning reading the terrain east of the fuel bay with the patience of someone who has been reading terrain for 11 years and trusts what she sees. The depot at Crestfall is quiet now. The range complex east of the perimeter received its approval 7 months after the mortar attack, partly on the strength of a letter I wrote in support of the request. I signed it without hesitation. That is the shape of what I owe.